So we have two short story writers here for you this afternoon. One is Intan Paramaditha and the other is Michael Giacometti. Michael would be familiar with you, of course, in Territorians because he was living in Tennant Creek and then Alice Springs for many years. Currently based in Tasmania. I probably don't need to read his bio because I know him so well. He used to work at the Writer Centre, in fact, when I was working at the Writer Centre. And short stories, essays, poetry. He was often shortlisted or won in the NT Literary Awards. And Spineless Wonders has published his first collection, his debut collection, My Life and Other Fictions. It's a fantastic collection of short stories that we'll talk about shortly. And our second guest, Intan, is originally from Indonesia, but she's currently based in Sydney. She's lecturing at Macquarie there in film studies and media. She's previously published two short story collections, Sihir Perempuan and Kumpulan Budak Setan. And her new collection, Apple and Knife, has been translated in English and published here by Brow Books. So the tricky thing with these two writers of short story collections, they don't really have anything much in common except that they write short stories. You'll notice the books are very different to each other, both of them incredibly complex but in different ways. So I'm just going to open with one broad question that they can both speak to, and then I will divide the rest of the session half-half. Bless you, person with hay fever there. I know the feeling, it's terrible. Sneeze all you like. Okay, so the broad question and the obvious question, why do you both write short stories as opposed to novels? Michael?
Well, I guess with probably not all short story writers, but many short story writers, short stories like the training ground in a way. I mean, I have a couple of ideas for novels, but it's also there, as I've started to find out when started to work on it, a lot more work, a lot more research, and then it's a completely different beast. I mean, it's complexity and size and everything like that. So, I mean, I was always, well, early on in my short story writing, I was more of the opinion, or not the opinion, but I was wondering how I could even write 1,000 words for a story. As years went by, the word limits or word lengths got longer and that sort of thing, but it's a way of encapsulating something a lot more succinctly, just looking at it in brief.
And some of the stories in his collection are very succinct. They're like 3 pages, and others of them are very long, like maybe 15 pages.
Yeah, I have learnt to trust the story to tell itself to its length rather than restrict it to some premeditated word count to start with.
And you are working on a novel now, aren't you, I believe?
Yeah.
Any idea how that might progress, when that might come out?
Well, it's something that I got an Arts NT grant for 6 years ago.
So you've got to do it or give the money back.
No. That ended up running out. They were like, you're taking too long. So it's something that I've had in mind for many, many years, and 5 years.
Right.
I'll give myself another 5.
Yeah. Okay, and Intan, why short stories as opposed to novel?
Okay, I think, so my early works were short stories because I was very much influenced by the short stories that I read in high school, and in college I read Edgar Allan Poe, O. Henry, Roald Dahl. I'm a big fan of Roald Dahl, and they all wrote short stories, right? And also there was this one short story that made me feel that, I should really write a short story. It's Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, because it it is a gothic short story about women's experience and how she tries to escape the confinement of her gender, and there's a whole idea about women's madness and so on. So I wrote short stories in my early 20s, mid 20s, but then I ended up writing different forms of literature. I do feel that the short story, I don't know, I don't really see it as a training ground for something larger. But I see that I really love the specificity of the medium. I think that in novel you can really play with the structure, and then in play, I've written a play too. You think about the audience, you think about the gaze, you think about how to look, and in the short story, maybe it's the appeal, at least to me, it is the single focus, and how from that single focus you can talk about so many layers. So and it's short, so you need to build the tension really fast. It's exciting that way. And also something specific to the Indonesian context is that there were more channels, at least when I started publishing, how many years ago? So 13 years ago. There were so many channels for short stories in Indonesia, the newspapers especially. So if you get published in the newspaper back then, it was really, something prestigious for writers. Now it doesn't matter that much, and people, because people can publish anywhere, they can publish online in their blogs, they can publish their novels independently. But back then, the short story was really something. So there were times when we would look at the Sunday paper, and we would try to find out who gets published there, and it was really exciting. Oh, okay, and we would talk about it for days if the story is really good. So there were, sort of a public sphere, a literary public sphere created by the newspaper back then. Yeah.
And we're going to start with Intan in a more focused way. I've only got the PDF of her collection of short stories, so sorry, I'm going to have to look at the laptop every now and then. So the collection Apple and Knife, available for purchase here at the bookshop. It's an amazing collection. The short stories all have different themes and different styles, but there are a couple of recurrent themes. The subjectivity of women is a big one, and the heterosexual relationship, which is sometimes dealt with as a kind of a war, really, a sort of a conflict zone, and then also a love zone. They seem to be recurring themes. We might actually have a look. Sorry, I didn't mention this one. I'm cheating. I told Intan which ones I was going to have a look at, but would you mind, can we have a look at Blood first? So, as I was saying, the subjectivity of women is a big one, and she has this short story where it's about women and menstruation and women's behaviour generally, the things they can and can't do. I'm just getting the actual story. And it starts off in this, in a room of people who are working on a menstrual product. They're trying to work out how to sell it, which is quite a nice kind of contemporary kick-off to the story. Did you want to read, or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think I will read in the middle.
Yep.
So this is the story of Mara, who is asked by her boss to create this ad for women's pads, and then she, instead of finding inspiration, she looks back to her past memories, and she remembers her dead mother, and she remembers how she learns about sexuality through her, not from her father, because her father is very distant, but from her Islamic Quranic recitation teacher. So I'm going to read that part. Here she remembers the time when she was in the 5th grade, when she first got her menstruation. After Mom died, teacher came to our house often, so often that I thought Dad would replace the photo of Mom that hung on the family room wall with teacher's picture. But 2 years later, Dad married again, and I realized that teacher would not be replacing my mother. I never got close to my stepmother, but at least she didn't make up stories about how my mother went to heaven, in contrast to the wicked who are tormented in hell. I didn't believe teacher because once, before my mother died, she told me that heaven and hell were as dark as shadows. Sometimes heaven and hell perch on your head like a butterfly, she said. Sometimes they disappear. Even though you are unaware that death is upon you, they appear to us in turn, as close as your breath. When I told Dad about my period, he just commented awkwardly, "Oh, I see." Teacher's lecture came the next day. Dad and I were like a human and a wandering spirit. He needed a medium to reach me, someone to act as a psychic. First Mom, then teacher. He must have told her. Traitor. "From this moment, your sins are tallied, Mara," said teacher. "Your mistakes are no longer your parents' responsibility, but your own. So bow your head at the sight of men. Have a sense of modesty. Don't speak loudly. You know, a woman should never become a singer." Wow, Mom liked to sing while she bathed. She fantasized about wearing a tight kabaya and performing with a gamelan orchestra, her hair tied in a knot. A woman's voice can tempt. It can invite fornication. What's fornication? What's between your thighs is a treasure. Don't sit with your legs open. Why? Many desire it. It is a source of disaster. Why? Teacher never explained. I decided I wasn't allowed to know because each prohibition invited danger. If I understood, I would crave the forbidden. Menstruation led me to know of a treasure chest sealed tight. It needed to be buried away, hidden beneath the sea, because it was bloody.
Fantastic, thank you. That was exactly the section I was wanting to look at because it speaks so strongly on the repression of women being told how to behave, being confined. And the story finishes beautifully with, because it's got the recurring motif of blood and menstruation, but right at the end, just trying to find the end, she's talking to this woman and the character says, "Why do you like blood so much?" I ask. "Your voice is hoarse and soft, so far away, so ancient, you whisper, because it's life."
I finished before the character encounters the ghost.
Yeah, which reminds me of another strong facet of the collection, horror. There's a good dousing of horror throughout the collection, something that's quite predominant in Indonesian film too. Do you want to speak to your to the use of horror in your short stories?
Yeah. So when I started the project about, a lot of these stories were, they came from my first short story collection, which was published in 2005. So quite old. The others came from the second one from 2010, and I think 2 are quite recent. So for the first short story collection, the idea is just the same. Basically, I want to write a collection of stories about disobedient women. And these women are quite different from each other. Some live in the city. They have their boring jobs at advertising companies and so on. Some others are housewives, secretaries. Some have very sort of conventional, banal jobs, but you still can see how they resist within the confinement of their culture, religion, and gender. And I have always been a big fan of horror films and horror literature. I did my BA at the University of Indonesia, and I wrote a thesis on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And it was the time in the late 90s. Oh, okay, I graduated in 2001. When I discovered that you could actually question the structures, you could actually subvert, or you could become subversive through horror. Because horror, I always see horror as a genre that really questions your assumptions of reality, right? Whenever you see something horrific, something that terrorizes you, you question whether the reality that you believe in is the right one, whether it's the truth. So in that way, horror is subversive, and I would like to explore that dimension, and turning horror stories into sort of feminist kind of writing. So I kind of see, because I'm a feminist, I see that feminism as a framework and practice that poses questions about the structure, right? Questions about patriarchal society, about the intersection between patriarchy and capitalism, or patriarchy and religion. It attempts to disrupt, to disturb. And the same thing goes to horror. So I kind of see that the two are sort of connected. So that's the initial interest to the horror.
So in the short story, The Queen, for instance, there's a contemporary story of this man who has affairs outside of his marriage, and he's wanting his business to go well. And he's got this wife he describes as sort of frumpy and boring. Mm-hmm. And then there are sections which pull on a traditional story, Indonesian story about a princess and who becomes a queen of the sea. And then he thinks he's going to meet this queen of the sea, and he gets these fantasies about her. And I love how that one finishes. Can I say how it finishes, or is that going to spoil it too much for them?
Don't spoil it.
Okay, all right. I won't say that, but I won't tell you how it ends. But a horrific ending. But I do love. I've highlighted one quote in here while you're talking about women. She's got a quote. Women so lacking in confidence that they kill themselves are no less worrisome than those obsessed with beauty. And I found that was a thread that came through quite a few of the stories. Okay, I'm just conscious of time, but I do want to very quickly talk about Kucek Hanum, because this goes into a different direction. Still strong women, powerful female characters, but it's also got a theme of colonialism. So there is this dancer/sex worker called Kucek Hanum, and I'm just trying to find it. Whoops. She gets to meet Gustave Flaubert and Maxime Duchamp, and there's this kind of interplay between those two, kind of European dudes who are trying to explore this Oriental world. So it taps into Orientalism and this figure of this powerful woman. Do you want to speak to that story?
Yeah. So Kucek Hanum is sort of one of those monstrous women in the book. Maybe that's the similarity between her and other women. But this is the only story set in 19th century Egypt. I was inspired by the photographs of Maxime Duchamp when he traveled to Egypt, Syria, Nubia, and Jerusalem, and how those photographs really informed the Europeans about the East, that it was a biblical site, or an ancient place where it was grandeur back then, like Ozymandias, but it sort of got stuck in the past and somewhat an exotic, of course, and it sort of justified colonialism. Yeah, so Kuchuk Hanum was, of course, a real woman, and Flaubert mentions that an Oriental woman is no more than a machine, in other words, a sex machine. And I guess what's really interesting to me is to make Kuchuk Hanum a subversive character that really defies all the expectations of these European men on sort of Oriental woman.
Yeah, and symbolically she withholds. One of them wants a yellow robe she's used in the dance, and she won't give it. It's a fascinating story. You can have a read of that collection, buy it, talk to Intan after the session, but I'm going to need to switch over to Michael now. Again, a really fascinating, diverse, complex collection of short stories. In the previous section, we were talking about some of his work that is historical in nature and some that investigates the colonial, post-colonial interface between First Nations Australians and European Australians. We sort of covered that a fair bit in the previous session, so I wanted to have a look at different aspects in this one this afternoon. Every story is so different, and I ended up thinking by the end, it's like Michael's a mimic. Every story, he kind of steps into a different narrative voice, a different character, and he totally kind of goes with that voice, and it can be in a different historical period, different culture, but the actual language, the style is just so different from story to story. We might have a look at some of the more contemporary ones, and also this great sense of humour too that comes through. So shall we, did you have a favourite you want to kick off with, or shall I make a pick? I mean, they're all so different. You could start anywhere. And the other thing that's interesting about Michael's collection is this underlying Buddhist theory throughout everything. And I was reading on his website that, correct me if I'm wrong, it's something about the character who's often trapped in a cycle of suffering and how you might try to transcend that and break free out of that cycle of suffering. So that kind of is a hum at the bottom of a lot of these stories, but then on the surface is very visceral stuff. We've got shit, piss, sex, we've got every bodily fluid you can imagine. It's like very visceral. Nothing's forbidden or in the cupboard. So he's got that kind of the grit of the human experience, and then the human spirit through that. So he's got a story about a character who walks through the bush all the time, and she knows, is it a she or a he? I've just guessed it's a woman, I don't know why.
The forking path. Yeah.
The forking path is a she. Yeah, and she goes away, and when she comes back, all the country's been burnt. And what I like is the way he describes the fire and how it came. So he describes it as, fire came like a distant relative that you once invited out of politeness, saying, come visit, we have a spare room, without any intention of them ever taking up the offer. Yes, fire came and walked against the flow of air and wind into your life, and with its hot breath ingratiated itself into your home. It left unwashed dishes and pizza cartons on the lounge room floor for a finger-thick trail of ants to clean. It drank the last of the full cream milk without replenishing or leaving a note, and you were forced to make powdered skim with shaky hands for your morning coffee. It ate the entire block of decadent chocolate you had stashed behind the red lentils. It camped in the lounge watching DVDs all day. It was there when you left for work in the morning, still there when you came home, not offering to make dinner, just there, always there with a question, 10 questions, when you just wanted silence and solitude. And that's how the fire came over the hill and marched through the grass and shrubs, like it was its right to do as it pleased. So there are these wonderful moments of comedy in amongst writing about landscape, about people, as we were saying before, people suffering and their transcendence of that, and predominantly set in Alice Springs, around that area, isn't it?
Well, that one is, that story in particular is set, it was just across the road from where I used to live, just in the hills there. It was a walk I did most days with the dog.
And Michael's not a stranger to walks. If you might know this story, he walked from one part of Queensland across the Northern Territory. Was it 450 kilometres across the sand? on his own, carrying a wagon in which he had water and food. How long did it take you, that walk across the desert?
24 days.
24 days in the desert. And you can see that coming through his work a lot. Actually, we might have a look at the beginning of Giacometti. It has a similar kind of sense to it. Do you want to read just the opening, just that opening paragraph there from the encounter at Giacometti, which gives you a sense of the landscape he paints in his stories?
Before I do that, a friend met recently and who'd read the collection of stories, and he's like, I really want to know what's going on in your head, because, you know, it just goes everywhere. Like, it's here, then it's there. It's like, what's going on in there? It's like, I don't know. It's just normal stuff. It's just everyday normal stuff. Okay. So, encounter at Giacometti. Ants transform the red dirt into broad avenues that shimmer with a relentless movement, like heat haze on tar. Flies mass on the unexpected feast, to maggotize, to multiply. The native cats, sated on the guts, juicy eyes, gristly ears, and meagre flesh, sleep through the interminable summer heat, leaving the carcass to improve in the outdoor oven. The animal is large, almost devoid of hair. The body is pitched forward into a rough sort of burrow, an unfinished excavation in the dry creek bed. Most of the nails on its front paws have been pulled off. The tips are bloodied stumps.
Wonderful. Through such gorgeous descriptive writing, he really drops us into these desert landscapes. And it's like we can start to hear the desert. And I'm going to go somewhere completely different now. And that is to his Raymond Carver story, because I just found it hilarious. Like I was saying, even though his work is so profound, he's also great at comedy. So if you remember Raymond Carver, do you remember the scandal around Raymond Carver? How in the end it was discovered it was his editing that made his short stories as strong as they were. So when you look at the original Raymond Carver and you look at the edited version, they're just nothing alike. Like Raymond Carver will rave on for about 4 pages, this interior monologue, and the editor cuts it to, she picks up the glass. Like, that's it. So he's written it in the voice of Raymond Carver after being edited, I think. I think the original Raymond Carver would have raved more than this. Or have you gone with how you think Raymond Carver is thinking?
I've gone with, well, there's more to it.
It's hard to tell.
There's more to it. Yeah, because, I mean, as you find in the story, like, there were, like, this is for his second collection of stories, the one that became what we talk about when we talk about love.
Yep.
Which Raymond Carver's manuscript didn't have a title. What we talk about when we talk about love was what his editor Gordon Lish renamed one of the stories. In the collection of Raymond Carver's stories, which was published a few years ago, with all his stories, and also had the original manuscript version of what we talk about when we talk about love, which they called Beginners, which was the Carver's title for that story. You get to see both, and you get to see the amount of change that his editor Gordon Lish made to the stories. I mean, there were some that were 40 pages long. Lish would reorganise the first half, then drop to the second half completely. It's a completely different story.
Yeah, very cheeky editing. And this is a phone call Michael starts with, and again, he's mimicking the voice of Raymond Carver here. Tuesday, 8th of July, 1980, 10:13 a.m. Gordon, he's talking to his editor. Gordon, Christ, I've been calling for hours. Yeah. Look, Gordon, I read the edits. Yes. No, Gordon, please let me explain. I read the edit, yes, yesterday. Then I guess I walked out of the house. I walked out of the house and got in the car and drove, just drove. I drove around town all afternoon. I don't know where I got to. I just kept on driving. I didn't notice anything except for every drugstore I drove past. I slowed down for nothing but those drugstores. My head spun slowly as I cruised past, seeing people go in, come out, in and out. So many people going in and coming out of those drugstores, but I kept driving. Got so I couldn't read the dials on the dash. I kept on driving until some guy pulled up beside me at a red light, wound down his side window and shouted at me, "You trying to kill someone or what?" He sped off when the lights changed. I sat there, the engine humming, wondering what to do. I flicked on the headlights and saw a gun store across the road. So now here I am, at home, all on my lonesome in the dining nook. My right hand is on the formica in front of me, fingers spread, forming a triangle on the table with two objects, a Smith & Wesson loaded, a fifth of 4 roses seal cracked. By God, Gordon, I haven't touched a drop in 3 years. Not since that last episode, you know that. But there's no one else around and I need to hold something and I don't know which one it's going to be. It's just great. If you know Raymond Carver's work, it's just so Raymond Carver-esque. It's hilarious. The session isn't very long, so I think we're going to have to go to questions. We've got sort of 5 minutes of questions. Yes, in the front.
When you were ready with your body of work, you went to publish your work. Did you have any problems presenting short stories? Because in your intro in the Wordstorm book, it says most publishers, mainstream publishers, aren't interested in short stories.
It was probably a bit different. Spineless Wonders, who published this book, that's what they do. They publish short stories. They're one of the smallest independent publishers in Australia. With this book, it was more the case of we had a handshake agreement that she's like, yes, I like your stories, because Bronwyn had read and edited some of them in the past. And then it was more a case of getting funding to get the book published, which took a few years and several applications to the Australia Council. It was then that I think I had 12 stories in at the time, and during the process of putting the book together, I said there's 1 or 2 other stories I'd like to write that I really would like to include in here. I'm not sure if I got to write them at all, but I wrote 8 other ones instead. So there were 20, I think it ends up being 19 that were included.
And Intan, I know you've been living as an expat for many years, but you started off being published in Indonesia. Short stories being published in Indonesia is still quite a big thing, isn't it? It's still quite strong?
Yeah, first of all, that's a fancy term, expat. In Indonesia, expat, they are all white people with a high income and they live in beautiful apartment buildings. So we do have a market for short stories, but the problem is outside Indonesia, if you want to get published overseas, that's where the problem starts. When Indonesia became the guest of honor of the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2015, there has been this conversation around, we should get Indonesian writers published abroad. So don't write short stories, people. And I was like, that is so demoralizing. Why should you set a limit to yourself to making yourself dependent on the market? But it was really, really hard to find a publisher for Apple and Knife. First of all, it's translated literary fiction. I don't know about the number in Australia, but in the US, it's just 3% of the total number of books published in the US. So it's already very small, and it's short story collection. So, my chances getting smaller and smaller. So I think we should really appreciate small independent publishers in Australia, because they're really the ones who champion short stories, translated fiction, and they're doing a really good job. I mean, Apple and Knife was picked up by Harvey Secker, the Penguin Random House group in the UK, to be published end of this year, but they decided to pick the book because I have a novel, so it's a 2-book deal. So I don't know what will happen if I don't have the novel. So in other words, it is kind of hard.
Yeah. other questions from the audience? Yes, at the back there.
So this is a question I think you could both speak to. Intan, as someone who writes short stories about being rebellious, and Michael as someone who's also tried to write novels. Do you think there's a difference in like social power or maybe say like influence between short stories and novels? And where on the scale do you think that is? Do you think it's more powerful if you can write something a lot more succinctly, or do you think the novels sort of, I guess, dominate the social sphere?
Oh, okay. So you can add more. Yeah, I think, I mean, again, I've mentioned that I don't see the short story as a training ground for something larger or something more important. I love the specificity of different medium. I've written a play too as well. But the reality is, in the global world of publishing, the novel is the dominant form, unfortunately. And this is, of course, a construction, because if you go back to 18th century, for instance, poetry was the ultimate art. But now, if you don't write a novel, it seems that you have less chances. But you know, again, I think it's really demoralizing if you limit yourself based on the market demands. I think you just need to write what you want to write, and there will be those daring small publishing houses who would champion the work, and the books that they publish are often more edgy and courageous. So yeah, so it doesn't matter.
Michael?
Yeah, so with the short stories, they would probably have more impact, because I agree that the novel's the general form for that sort of thing, because you can explore something more deeply and more broadly. But a collection of short stories that is linked to a topic or theme could do the same or even more, because each story can be much more succinct and compact and have a lot more power, rather than a novel which sort of builds and builds more slowly. So even a novella, or like short novel sort of thing.
Right. Thanks so much, Intan and Michael.
Thank you.